Hello, everybody. Welcome. I hope that you can actually see me. It's one of those wonderful opportunities where I can't necessarily tell whether or not you can see me, but I can see the participant chat box, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback during the discussion today. So we're going to be talking about leadership. I'm talking to you from the moon. At least it looks like that on my image. So please do use the Q&A. It's really important to ask your questions as we go, and I'll try and dip in and out and make it interactive, and I will have time for questions at the end. So I'm going to share my screen, and I hope that you can all see this. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today about advancing women in leadership. This comes from the context of the Women's Health Research Translation Network brand. And the Women's Health Research Translation Network is an NHMRC-funded initiative whereby the federal government has funded us to assist and enable women to advance their careers in the context of the fact that there is persistent gender equity in a range of areas, including in research and indeed in healthcare. One of the first things I'm going to note is that I have put all my titles and postnomials on the first slide. Is one thing that we find which occurs quite differently from men and women is owning our credibility and using our titles. And whilst it's not necessarily something that many of us may be comfortable with, and indeed it's not something I did in the past, the evidence is that we actually potentially undervalue our credibility by not actually putting our roles and our titles up and making sure we introduce other women by those roles and titles. So I'm going to talk to you today about some current scenarios in terms of where women are in leadership, talk about what leadership is as a concept, some of the barriers to progress for the individual around capability, capacity and credibility. And I'll actually give you some examples from my own personal career journey around that. But then talk about the fact that we really need to change the system. This is not up to every one of us on this call today as individuals to fight a system which is inherently unfair, but more to be able to understand what the barriers are for us as individuals and how we might be objective about addressing those, but also to recognise that it really does require systems level change, which is underway and is encouraging. But by seeing it as a systems level problem, we can often step above it and move forward. So just in terms of employment, the majority of women in the Australian workforce are in healthcare and social services, in education and training, and in retail trade. And indeed, 1 in every 4 Australian women who are working are actually in health and social care. And when you add education and retail trade, it's the vast majority of women in the workforce. Few of us are actually full-time, and many are part-time, and another proportion are casual. And that comes with its own disadvantages, especially with an ageing workforce. Many women in their 50s plus find themselves in casual employment, which very much limits their ability, for example, to access rental housing. And in fact, the highest group in the community with increasing homelessness is an unprecedented rise in the casually employed single women over the age of 50. But essentially what we know is that we work in particular sectors, and in fact, Australia has one of the most segregated workforces in the world. In other words, we have male career paths, we have female career paths, and we don't integrate as much as most of the other OECD countries. So in that context, this is just an example of healthcare, but you could use a similar example for academia. It's delivered, you would argue teaching is delivered by women, but as you move up to the top of the rank in terms of the most senior positions, they are disproportionately still male. And this is not a woman's problem. So this came from the Global Healthcare Workforce Network report. It is a systems and culture problem. Back years ago, decades ago, when I graduated, women were the predominant graduates in medicine, for example, and yet that has not flowed through because it's not a pipeline issue. It's actually a systems issue that stops equity in progress. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about what is leadership. And again, I just encourage you to try and use that chat, and I'll come back to some comments in there as I can. So leadership is, and I'd like you again to perhaps put some thoughts down in the chat, and not necessarily the Q&A, but Q&A or chat, about what you think leadership might be. So I'm going to give you a moment to reflect. You can write it down on a piece of paper near you. You can pop it in the comments, whatever you prefer. I'll get you to just think about that for a moment. So far, everyone's telling me they can see me and the slides are good, which is great. Now, if any of you wish to add any thoughts or anything, please do. But essentially, what leadership is it's not about managing finance and budgets and people. They're a critical component. Being able to manage is important, but leadership is much more about inspiration of others and bringing them on a journey to do something that's far more impactful than you can do alone. So it's about guidance. It's about working together towards a solution, about creating a vision that everybody buys into and could co-create ideally. It's about teamwork, direction, strategy, communication, and setting goals together. Very little of that has to do with management, finance, and HR. You need those things to get there, but the leadership is the bit that sits above. And many people don't think about leadership as being a set of skills or indeed as part of their job. But we know that it is, for many of us, part of our jobs as either academically qualified, tertiary qualified, or researchers, or indeed healthcare professionals. For many of us, we have a responsibility, a capability, a capacity to lead, and often you just don't necessarily think about it and stumble through the sorts of roles we have without being objective about this. And that's not necessarily good for you as leaders, or indeed for the people you're leading. So it is worth thinking about leadership as a concept and what your sphere of leadership influence is. So it's actually defined as an ability of an individual, group, or organisation to lead, influence, or guide others. That could be an individual, might be your PhD student, your junior staff member, the teams that you're involved in, or the organisations that you work with. It's not about what position you are. The most influential role I have and have had in my career, I have only a very small, incredible, dedicated team that work with me. And indeed, my next, probably my almost equally influential, is a research group that are fairly reasonable size, but it's not so much about our size or the fact that there's a certain number of people reporting to me. It's more about the ability to inspire and reach much, much broader circles. So it's really not about being the boss of a group of people. And indeed, many of you, I think, could think now, and I'd like to get you all to think about that. Who do you know who's in a leadership position where they don't really have good leadership skills? They may not inspire you. They may, in fact, sometimes demotivate you. So think about the fact that just because you're in a position of authority does not necessarily mean you're a good leader. Leaders can operate at any level. There are some spectacular examples of leadership amongst our very early career academics. In fact, some of ours are quite spectacular. There are others in very senior roles who don't have that same leadership capability or recognition of skills. So you can operate at any level. It also doesn't necessarily just have to be in your workplace. You might have a leadership role in your community group, indeed in your family, broader family, in your school context, even a leadership role as a member of a team where you're not the senior person there. So it is different to responsibilities around management, and it's also not an automatic skill. You don't have a tertiary qualification, or indeed even potentially a PhD or a healthcare qualification that actually gives you the right to be a leader by virtue of the fact that you have those other skills. So being an engineer or being a doctor or being a lawyer does not make you a leader. And in fact, that assumption of leadership through technical skills is often quite problematic in our field. That's especially the case in academia. Australia has a very hero-led type of model of academia. It's all about your individual track record and shoulders of whom you climbed over to get there. And it's not necessarily about your leadership skills and ability. And it's not about your IQ, but more about your emotional intelligence and your awareness around skills. So leadership is learned. It is recognised, it's honed, and it requires self-awareness. Because if you don't understand your own strengths and weaknesses, you then can't actually lead others. And it might sound like it's yet another thing to put on top of your skill set you need to acquire. The great news about leadership is it doesn't take anywhere near the effort and time and awareness that many of you have put into your exceptional previous qualifications. So the sorts of types of leadership styles include autocratic, That's the sort of concept we often think of as a masculine style of leadership. It provides clear direction. This is the way we're going. It's very much about control. It's about hierarchy. And in a time of crisis, Churchill stepping up at the war, that's actually quite important. But for the majority of the time, especially transformative change, it can be quite disengaging. People have low morale, especially the younger generations who just are not interested in engaging in that type of leadership. They're not brought up in that context. They don't respect that type of leadership. And so for most of us, autocratic doesn't really work. For democratic, that's about building a consensus. That takes longer. It's about strong investment in engaging people, in giving them multiple opportunities to engage, understanding that people do this differently. Some of your most spectacular thinkers in your team will be your quietest, most introverted, who really ponder the challenges that are put out there. They're not just blurting out whatever comes into their mind, which our wonderful extroverts like myself often do, but actually creating spaces and opportunities for those people to contribute is really important. But it's really inclusive. That actually requires greater skills in leadership than an autocratic style. It requires more resilience, more emotional intelligence, but it often is much more likely to drive transformational change and to build loyalty. But it can be a bit isolating. It can be isolating for the individual who's doing the leadership, but also for those who are being led. Sometimes people don't feel like there's an inner circle and they're not in it. So you have to be truly inclusive if you're going to do that. There's a laissez-faire type of leadership, people who delegate, very hands-off, they're trusting. But the critical thing is that you've got to provide enough support and direction. If you simply let people go and they don't feel supported or have enough direction, that's a problem. And then the other one is of the classic types of leadership is transformational. And that's the person who inspires, engages, builds loyalty, and often has impact. But it is quite dependent on the leader, and the leader can often, leader and the team can experience burnout. So all of these styles have strengths and weaknesses, and they're obviously a very stereotyped categorization. But we often don't think about the styles of our leaders. We just find things that annoy us or things that inspire us without thinking about why. And they're not even necessarily reflecting on our own leadership style. So the other thing is that the best leaders are actually very adaptive. And so, for example, I'll tell you a little bit about this later, but I've done quite a bit of leadership training in my career. And there is very, very rare times where I'm autocratic. And the times I would be autocratic is where I'm micromanaging a very significant problematic staff member who's struggling, where there could be bullying and harassment claims, and there is broken relationships, lack of trust, and there's really no way out of it than to micromanage that process. Very much not my preferred option, but sometimes necessary. Most of the time I operate in the democratic and transformational space, but as people become more senior, for example, those who move from early to mid and senior career as academics and as clinicians, I, by necessity, should become more laissez-faire and allow them more autonomy, trust them, but they'd just be there more and more just as a backup and support person. So you will actually have to adapt your leadership style to your team. You can't simply sit in one box, but you'll have a preference. And understanding that preference and knowing when to manage that preference becomes really important. So leadership is based on inspiration, not domination, and on cooperation, not intimidation. And indeed, the evidence is that a diverse leadership team that does this is much more likely to drive sustainable change. An authoritative, autocratic, top-down control leader might get change temporarily, but it will not be sustained. And so if you want to make a big difference, you jump in the boat, get everyone in the boat with you, all agree on where you're rowing together, and then get them all rowing there and inspired. And then if you jump out of the boat, that's okay, because they're going to keep going because they know where they're going. So leadership is a concept, it is a skill set, it is an awareness, it's a recognition of the importance of inspiring and how to inspire. It's not about your position, so you can do it from any career stage in any position. There is some stereotyped concepts around masculine versus feminine leadership, and they're about styles, not sex and gender. But traditionally, we would equate the more autocratic styles of leadership with male sex, and the more feminine types of leadership styles, which are more caring, inclusive, less assertive, with people who are female sex. That is a very stereotyped paradigm, and there are obviously problems with that. But there is some biological basis to some of those preferences that people have, and there's also some societal overlay around that. And it's just important to be aware. We can't go into that in great detail today, but it is there. But being objective about it and understanding it helps people to move past barriers they may find in leadership. My personal preference is collective democratic consensus, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the work I've done around developing my own leadership. So I'm giving you a bit of an insight here because leadership's a journey across your career. When you start early in your career, you're often very good at detail. If many of you have done a PhD or done your basic health professional training, you can think back to the degree of detail that you used to be able to go into. And as you move further up your career, it's more and more painstaking to get your head back down in the weeds in detail. And it's much more occupied in higher level strategic thought. But as you go on that journey, it's really important to continue to be self-aware, to continue to focus on your leadership style, and to continue to learn about how you can have different experiences and how you can increase the impact of what you do. And that is very much the case if you want to advance your career in research, but also in clinical practice. So essentially, that requires ongoing personal reflection and awareness. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit now about barriers to progress for the individual woman and about capability, credibility, and capacity, and how we make a change to the system. I'm going to give you a little bit of information here, I suppose, from the literature. This is actually in a medical context, but the literature is very similar in other areas. What this particular research did, which looked at medical deans as well as basically deans in academia, as well as different senior levels in medical leadership, and what the barriers were for people to get there. And everyone pretty much agreed that it wasn't a pipeline anymore. In fact, the highest growing group in the Australian workforce, the largest group, is actually professional young women. And if you look at many of the Scandinavian countries, some of their medical workforces and trainees are now up about 80% women. So it's very much not about the pipeline or the input to the system, but more about the fact that there are barriers within there. So the other thing is that the assumption that women are not interested in leadership or don't have a natural talent is not so pervasive either, but there is significant unconscious bias in the system, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So just before we do that, quick visit on what is gender equity and gender equality. So gender equity is the process and the practices that are required to reach equality. So it means how you make sure that there's a fairness of treatment for women and men. And I won't get into the other genders at the moment, but clearly that becomes really important. As according to their respective needs and interests. This may include equal treatment or treatment that can be different, but actually considered equivalent in terms of the rights, benefits, and opportunities. So it doesn't mean it's the same, it means it's equivalent. And then the outcome of that is gender equality, which is equal ease of access to resources and opportunities, regardless of gender. And that includes economic participation, decision-making, valuing different diverse behaviours and values. It doesn't mean that men and women and other genders are the same, but that their rights and responsibilities and opportunities do not just depend on their biological sex. And gender equality is a UN Sustainability Development Goal. Most of the definitions don't extend to genders beyond male and female, and clearly that needs to advance in the literature. But the principles are the same around the fact that we're looking at equivalent fairness in the system for access. One of the interesting things about the research that we and others do in this space is that people, especially Australians and often women, think that the most important thing is merit or fairness. So there's a big pushback against any sort of affirmative action, and the recent very big change by NHMRC to move to an equitable proportion of successful applications is really pretty brave in Australia. And one of the reasons for that is we have followed or swallowed, I think, the meritocracy argument very much so. So many people will say, well, I only want to get this job if I get on merit, not because of a particular sex or gender. But the reality is that merit assumes a fair starting line. And in Australia, this is actually what it looks like. So women start behind the 8 ball, There is inherent biases about our ability to undertake leadership, both in ourselves as a sex, but also amongst others. We have major barriers that is very disproportionate in Australia around capacity for childcare and other areas, credibility, and also in just generally inequality. So the merit argument is actually not valid. And when you start to consider the other really critical intersectional factors, such as ethnicity, disability, age, and age is a really big barrier amongst women. We have a more ageist approach to women. Once women are over the age of 50, they're often thought of as being older and not necessarily of a leadership ilk, whereas men tend to be attributed as being wiser and better able to lead as they age. So there's inherent biases in the system people don't see. And the argument about merit is fundamentally flawed because it assumes equivalent playing field. So I'm just going to stop for a second, and I want you all to think about what might differ in terms of capacity for a woman or female, if we'd like to put it that way, to be able to lead in academia and healthcare in any field. What might be the factors that affect their capacity? And while you're doing that, I'm just going to have a quick look at the comments so far. If I can get my mouse to get me where I need to go. I'll let you up there. That's right. So the main things that actually affect us in terms of capacity is this. So Australian women have the highest educational attainment in the world. However, we are 70th and falling in terms of relative economic opportunity compared to our male colleagues. And the reason for that is we have an incredible inequitable distribution of labour. And indeed, we take the vast majority of family responsibilities, the house responsibilities. We make about 85% of the health and wellness choices and burden in our families, and often attempt to also maintain friendships. But this is very disproportionate in Australia and far more dichotomised than it is in other countries. For example, parental leave for our partners is often really difficult, and the burden therefore primarily falls to women to do that activity, and we have the most expensive childcare system in the world. So the number one factor that determines whether women actually succeed in their career and sustain this during those early childhood years is actually workplace flexibility. And whilst that's not possible everywhere, actually negotiating workplace flexibility is really important. But that also means participating such that you do and can contribute to the team. They're not carrying the load, but you do have that flexibility in the workplace. The other thing is thinking about if it's a capacity issue, if we value ourselves as leaders, then part of that is actually how we are going to work well for our team. And that means we value our time. So negotiating either assistance or support at home, or better role sharing. That does not mean your partner doing things for you. There's some really good research around that, both ways, but more about role sharing. So having distribution of roles, having much more equitable parenting if you do have a family, and actually sharing some of that load at home or outsourcing. But we often don't tend to respect ourselves in this space. And in fact, if I can give you an example, I have a pretty spectacular team here of quite senior qualified women who are very capable, because we work in women's health. And yet when COVID hit and we're all in the most lockdown city in the world, the automatic position or default position was, in fact, I was having Zoom meetings with all of these women sitting around the table actually doing the homeschooling. And their partners were all going to work, not on carers leave, or in the study. And the discussion was, we don't want you to fall back in your career here. Can you think about sharing that load? And the biggest barrier was that it hadn't occurred to any of them to ask and to actually renegotiate that with their partners. And the next biggest barrier was they're all convinced their partner couldn't do as good a job, which is a problem, because if they never do it, they never will be able to do as good a job. But we need to obviously be careful that we're not our own worst enemy. In terms of capabilities, it's interesting because actually women tend to have about 10% more productivity for the hours that they're in the workplace, but they have much more limited confidence. So on average, a male applying for a position will have around 4 to 5 of the 10 requirements in the position description and will be confident they can do the role. Women often have 9 or 10 and are still not confident they can do the role. So they'll apply at a later stage in their career and are less confident to put the hand up, or they're offered the role and don't take it, or they undermine their contribution. And I've done this, as have many. We had a women in leadership program, which I run, have run for many years, and the stories are always really important. And a young woman was listening recently, really bright, clinician academic, and I was sharing the stories about how I'd been offered a professorship when I was younger, and my immediate response was, no, I'm not quite up to deserving that yet. I'll take the role if it's it's an associate professorship, and I'm not sure I can do the job, so put me on for a year rather than 5. And we had all these negotiations where I tried to undersell what I was going to be able to do and not raise expectations, until the chair of the board, this is a joint position across not-for-profit and the university, sat me down and said, I would never have this discussion with a man, but we headhunted you because we think you're capable of the role. We need a professor because of the following. You are capable of doing it, which is why we've come to you, and this is the deal we're giving you, and you'd be a fool not to take it. And I remember being quite shocked about the fact that I had just automatically fallen into underselling whether I could deliver something. And this young woman in the recent program said, as she said, when I told that story, she said, well, actually, I've been a fool. I was offered a senior role, but I offered to do the job and not take the title. And I've done the job and not had the funding or the title or the authority, but I've done all the work because I didn't think I was going to be good enough to take the role. And she only had that aha moment when it was pointed out. So we often fall to a position of not having that confidence, and there are many contributors to that. So critically, when you second guess yourself about whether your skills or ability are good enough, double check, stop and think about that. And indeed, mentors are incredibly powerful. So there are a couple of key contributors that are evidence-based, and indeed we've published the systematic review and some of the literature in this area in the Lancet series recently. But essentially for women, leadership training and skills and mentoring are critical. They're not enough, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but they are really important. And it turns out that having a male mentor is often a more strategic advantage for women because they may think slightly differently to what we do. But what they will do is give you confidence to let you know that you probably can do some of these things. They may inspire you. They may think of different opportunities for you to work through. And indeed, I always say, if out of any of these, the one message you come away with is to be objective about the barriers that are there for you to advance. And then secondly, to get a mentor. And often that's easy to do and people are not sure how to do it. But there is a mentoring video presented by Dr. Mariam Musa, which is on the Women's Health Research Translation Network website. And if you want to get the link to that, please go and have a look at it. And it goes through what mentoring is and really basic steps on how to get a mentor and how to be a mentee. But it is a very powerful strategy for women. And it's not one mentor, it's a series of mentors. And the last of the C's is credibility. So the problem is if you look different to everyone else around you or to what people anticipate will be a leader, which, as it turns out in Australia, is a 50-plus-year-old, rather paunchy, bald, Caucasian male. And if you're a younger, petite Asian female, you don't look like what people think are a leader, and your perspectives are not valued, your input might be bypassed, and the people are up their ladder of inference before you start that you're not actually who they expect as a leader. And this image here is of Priscilla Kincaid-Smith, who was one of the only specialists, medical specialists who'd done research when I first came out of my training. So I'd done my undergraduate medical training, my specialty training, and then a PhD, and came up with the young family and really wanted to have an academic clinical career and a family. And there was almost no one who'd done that, except indeed the absolutely exceptional Priscilla Kincaid-Smith, who'd become a world leader. And this is a picture of her as the head of the International Medical Federation. And she clearly doesn't look like what anybody else does. And that concept of being the odd person out is really very alive and well. And one of the reasons why, if you're going to go into leadership roles, it's always legitimate to try and make sure you're not the only one, and to always encourage diversity in leadership. So there's many strategies that can be used to enable a much more conducive environment, to enable credibility across leadership. and also to call out very diplomatically, not aggressively necessarily, to call out people when they make assumptions about the lack of leadership credibility. And often they don't realise they're doing that. And one of the things about that is that's about changing the system. It's not a lack of credibility in the individual because they're young or they have a different ethnic background or English isn't their first language or they have a disability or they're of a different gender than male, but more about the way the system is set up. So we need to see that and then be able to move beyond it. So how did that affect my career? So by the time I read this work, I look back with some degree of lament and wished I'd understood all this previously. And so I'd become a very opportunistic accidental leader. Originally in my career, I didn't put my hand up for leadership roles. I didn't apply. I was sure I wouldn't be able to do them or I wouldn't have the capacity to do them. But I had amazing male mentors, and they were male because there were no female mentors that were in the position that I aspired to. And they have made a massive difference in my career. And so they had quite a bit to do with being headhunted for academic and clinical roles and giving me the confidence to do it. But the biggest thing for me, and I'm not suggesting you do this, but I'm just giving you some insight, is that I was nominated to do an exec MBA program. And I had already done 18 years of secondary education. I had 2 young children, the youngest of whom was very challenging. And I just didn't think I needed anything else. But it's hard to say no to a CEO who puts you up for one of these. So I said yes. And it was, to me personally, the most spectacular learning journey of my career. A lot of it was about understanding yourself, understanding the job of a leader, being able to depersonalise and step back from challenges both for yourself and others. And it really was a truly privileged learning experience. And I then got the opportunity to go and do a Williamson Community Leadership Program a day a week for a year. And what that did was change my approach to things completely, to being a person who sort of subsisted juggling all those balls that we saw before, family, work, etc., to someone who actually was far more valued what I could bring, and therefore still did that, but with a lot more help, and then was quite strategic about taking on roles. So in other words, I got courageous. So what I also did was develop my personal drivers. Why do I go to work? What are my values? Because I loved being home with my children. And I hate to think that any woman who wants to have a family, or man, anyone who wants to have a family, feels they can't because of career barriers, because I honestly think it is very possible to do both and to be strategic. And yes, it is sometimes really difficult to juggle, but it is not impossible. And so for me, I needed strong reasons to be at the workplace rather than potentially at home. And so I had to work out what my motivators were to go to work, why I went, what I got my energy from, how I got my work ethic so that I didn't really feel like I was working, and get that balance of autonomy and demand. And for me, it was really about impact. So if I want all of you now, I want you to think about, if I asked you, do you seek to have power? I want you all to think about that and actually commit to whether or not, and we'll talk a little bit about this, whether or not you would seek to have power. And in my case, the facilitator asked me that. My instant response was no, because to me, this is power. Donald Trump, position, authority, the boss up on the top, and as opposed to the leader down in the trenches. And when my facilitator in the MBA asked me, do I aspire to have power, I instantly said no. He then challenged me quite assertively and said, why do I go to work? I said, right, it's to have influence and impact for my patients, my people I'm working with in my research team, the broader community. And so he basically challenged me, what right do I have to think that that is not power? Because that type of leadership is much more powerful and sustained. And it's not about physical might or mental or moral efficacy, but really about the influence you can have. And I want all of you to think about, if you didn't say yes to the concept of power, that maybe you need to change that paradigm. So what about my capacity and flexibility? Well, in my life, these were my wonderful, gorgeous, darling children. And the little one at the top left might have looked absolutely cute, but was an absolutely horrid toddler. Fortunately, she grew out of it. But these two came along, and there was nothing around to say, well, actually, you need to have some allowances now. You can't just have your family and not feel permanently guilty and keep going at your career the way you did before. So actually stepping back and saying, no, I've got permission to actually juggle for a little while here in the preschool years. and this is my husband in the middle here, who's a respiratory intensivist academic. And basically between us, we negotiated and essentially both co-parented the children. And we outsourced. We were fortunate enough to be able to do that. That included to family, but also a bit of outside help. But our focus was raising the children, and we outsourced some of the other things like when we could. And essentially, never regret this. And it was still to this day one of the best things I've done. And my two daughters are now 21 and 24. But at the time, I just didn't allow myself the recognition to stand back and say, I can't do it the same way. But still keep going with my career. And indeed, that's what I felt like. And I think people feel often alone. I used to feel like I had cannonballs chained to my ankles, and people said, just keep going like you always have. So we need to actually recognise that if you have children for a brief period of time, or if we're looking after aged parents, or both, for a period of time, we're going to need to have some less intensity and support, but then we need to work strategies around that to help. And in terms of capability, as I mentioned before, I often would be unsure if I was capable of doing things. And my strategy there was actually to have spectacular male role models who have since become sponsors and have really made a massive difference to my career. So I went from being a clinician and an academic to being braver about putting my hand up. And I became head of unit. I put my hand up to be president of societies, which I would never, ever have conceptualised when I was younger. I've been on the national, the NHMRC research committee. I've had senior government roles and in NGO, and I've continued to be a mother and a partner through that. And one of the passionate things I've been focused on is training and mentoring the next generation so they can recognise some of these things objectively and don't just have to keep ploughing through headlong without recognising what is actually there. And all the time, I kept focusing on what my purpose was. I'm actually going to skip over this a little bit because I'm in the interest of time. But one of the things I'd like to talk to you about now is it's fine to say that you can recognise that power is important and that leadership is inspiring others and having impact, and that you can do it when you have a family. And I've glossed over that, but it is possible. But you do need to give yourself a bit of a break and recognise and value yourself, and don't necessarily take on all responsibilities. But even if you do that and you develop skills in leadership and you have a mentor who encourage you to do things, the reality is that it's not just about your ability. So leadership is also about your motivation and your opportunity. And that's what influences our behaviour. So many of my male colleagues would get really frustrated and say, but I've offered, these people a job, or I've told them they could do it, or I've created this position and I've mentored them and they're not taking up the opportunity. And the reason for that behaviour is multifactorial. So it's those societal things around capacity and capability and credibility, but it's also, you can have all the skills in the world, but you're in a workforce or an employment situation or a system where you can't see yourself. There may be no female interventional cardiology academics where you can't see what you could be. And sometimes you can't be what you can't see. And that especially is the case if you have other intersectional challenges like ethnicity, etc. And the other thing is you may also not have the opportunity. And that is a lot about your workplace and the culture in which you work and the field in which you work. And those things influence your motivation to act. So, for example, a massive amount of money spent on STEM, or women in science, technology and mathematics. And there was a lot of money spent. Managed to attract all these women into the field, but they leave. And they leave necessarily often because there is no motivation. There's not the opportunity, and they come out into the same culture and they don't like that environment, don't thrive in it, and don't see themselves in that position. So unless we address the system, we're not going to fix this. And just your own ability and desire to forge through won't necessarily make it easier. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about a national initiative. So we are linked now to the SAGE, or the Gender Equity Initiative in Advanced Education. And we run alongside in parallel that one called Advancing Women in Healthcare Leadership. And this is about the fact that there is a massive amount of literature showing all the barriers, challenges and problems with getting gender equity. There's a pile of literature on fixing the woman by training her in leadership and raising awareness, but there's very little on changing the system and the culture in which we work. And this is the big barrier. It's the same with sexism, racism. It's the same actually with the whole concept of blaming individuals for obesity and weight gain, even though it's 65% of the Australian population. This is not about the individual alone. It's actually about the system where we work. So we undertook as a leadership initiative to drive change, and indeed looked for what actually makes a difference. And in this case, it's the healthcare sector, but now also engaging across the academic sector. So what matters to the workforce and women in the workforce? What works to change the workforce? What implements and actually makes a difference, and what scales across the system? And so I had been asked many years ago to work in the largest health service in the country to improve a problem that was perceived around sexual harassment. And I was asked by the board chair and the CEO, and I declined, partly because I was the only woman in a medical leadership role at the time, but also because I said, look, that's not really my role. But what I will do is create an environment and culture where more women are in senior leadership roles in the organisation, and you'll find that change will happen with diversity of leadership. So we started an all-of-organisational change program. We had strong leadership and commitment. We had a committee, but we had a large awareness and promotion program. We embedded a leadership program within the organisation, which has persisted for 7 years and trained hundreds of women, and we've evaluated the impact it made on their career. And those 3 days of leadership development and recognition have actually changed careers, and the evaluation's been quite astounding. We built mentors and male champions of change, had a series of events, changed policies, advanced positions, and now there is quite good evidence on evaluation of the impact. But how do we do that more broadly? So it's not just a group of women we're training to lead or a single organisation we're working with, but how do we drive organisational change so the individual woman is working within an organisation that actually gives them motivation and opportunity? And that is around now a multi-million-dollar research and translation program, which we lead, where we have 15 partners across academic and healthcare services, government, and also multiple colleges and stakeholders, basically, more broadly. And this is not medical knowledge necessarily. In fact, it's actually a lot of research from business and organisational change, social sciences. So phase one was around knowledge generation of what the problems are and how we address them. Then we developed multifaceted interventions with our partners. They're in the process of actually implementing them in their organisations. We have inbuilt evaluation, and then we're looking at how we scale this up. And that simple sentence is a couple of years of work, but it is really quite inspiring to see these organisations change. These are just some of our partners, and indeed embargoed, but we have had some very good news about the next phase of this work last week. So I'm going to stop there and talk a little bit and just take the opportunity for everyone to ask their questions. If I can just stop sharing my screen, so bear with me. Wonderful modern technology. Yeah. For some reason. Sorry, I'm having difficulty. Okay, I'm hoping that I'm not sharing my screens anymore. So I can now see some of your questions, and I'll start to chat in there. Thank you. I didn't realise the chat was disabled. Thank you. So some of the answers have come across there about enabling others and mentorship of others. I really like that comment about leadership, owning the problems and sharing the credit. Absolutely. I remember my my mentor / sponsor nominated me for an Order of Australia. I didn't know. It's a confidential process. Would never have thought about doing it. Wouldn't have stopped to think that was important, actually, as an individual. And then when I was notified, it was just an email in my inbox after a 2-year process. I didn't know whether to be proud of that or feel really uncomfortable. And in fact, I felt quite uncomfortable because what I was being recognised for is the work of a team. It's definitely not my work. And when I actually tried to reconcile that with my mentor and my team who'd nominated me, I finally recognised that actually it was important for all of us because it was a boost to our work. And in my recognition acceptance, I talked all about the work of my team. I didn't talk about the family. My family is very precious to me, but this wasn't about me as an individual. Therefore, it wasn't about my family. This was actually about the contribution and the great work that the team do. And it made me much more able to work on that. Thank you. Many of you have pointed out the chat was disabled. I'm so sorry. So other comments you got in here around building a positive culture and leading by example, really important. Easy to say sometimes, but there is good examples on how to do that. Good question from Bibke Katz around can leadership be learnt, or is it inherent? The assumption is it's inherent, but the reality is it can be learnt. Many leadership traits can be learnt, and one of the reasons is there's always room for more self-awareness. And whilst you might not be the person who has all the skills you need, you can surround yourselves by others who have those skills, and you can learn strategies to deal with that. For example, I'm very extroverted, so how do I make sure I keep myself quiet and give my critical introverted team members the opportunity to contribute? Things like preparing agendas and setting them out beforehand and making sure that papers are circulated gives people who like time to think more time to think and prepare. Going around the room, especially a virtual room, but also the room physically, and giving everyone an opportunity to contribute is important. But I have to constantly remind myself of that. So yes, you can definitely learn it, and we can always be better, but very much a learned skill. And then, yes, so reluctance to take on a senior role at work may reflect concerns about balancing work demands and other commitments. That comes to that capacity, but often our strategies around that, or the evidence suggests that the strategies are not to value ourselves and try and manage our capacity and seek help. It's just to say we can't do it, as in we can't balance things. And so sometimes that's about negotiating a sort of interim position or a trial period or covering someone when they're on leave to actually see if you can manage it, as well as working with those around you. Yes, actually, Helen and Linda, can you please share the link to the mentor video in the discussion here? I have a question about what organisational change do we need to make it easy for men? Oh, absolutely. And that's not such an organisational change. That's actually a national policy change. Being able to share parenting leave is a huge barrier for many partners who want to do that. One of my stories is that when I went to pick up my children from kinder one day, one of the mothers came to me and said, "You are so lucky." And I said, "Yes, but why?" She said, "But your husband does drop off and pick up." And she said, "My husband could never do that." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Oh, he's got such an important job. There's no way he'd have that flexibility." And I said, "What does he do?" And she said, "He's an intensive care specialist." And she said, "What does your husband do?" And I said, "He's an intensive care specialist." Needless to say, she got her husband to renegotiate at work, and he started coming to pick up. But the point was, it was very unusual at the time for my husband to negotiate with his senior people in this department to say, on the days I'm not having to start my ward round at X, I need to start later, or I need to start earlier and finish earlier. So he still did his full contribution, but required flexibility. And one of the reasons he got it was people in the organisation knew who I was and knew we were married, and that was a bit unusual back then. And so there was flexibility around that contribution. But interestingly, it was uncommon, and it's much harder for men to negotiate that, or partners. So absolutely. It isn't easy for men to take leave, and we have to support and encourage that at a policy level, which is some of the work we're doing nationally. So them wanting to co-parent, they're often also judged by their peers and by their workplace. It's never necessary to take a leadership training course, Seema, but it is really valuable if you want to have leadership roles in your career. And you can often just dip your toe in. As I said, there's the range of leadership. There's things like this, which are very brief. There's the 3-day program, like the one we run, and there's a number of others. Just be careful. The word leadership often ends up with $5 signs behind it. There is nothing special about leadership training that's different to any other training we get, except, sorry if I'm offending any of my business colleagues, but except it's often run by business schools and universities or private enterprise, and it costs a fortune and doesn't need to. So, for example, there are programs that come at much lower cost, or even programs like Leadership Victoria that are funded by not-for-profit and become freely available. The question from Yiling about the right mentor, that's a whole talk in itself, and I will get you to look at the link, and we'll send it out by email after this, because it's a really important strategy for your career. You don't need to know where you're going. You don't need to have a leadership role. You don't need to be anything but in a career path to get a mentor, because your mentor will help you pass those barriers. And you need to, that's a long answer, so I'll put that link in there. Now, someone said, "Thanks for the presentation. I'm an ECR having just completed a PhD. Tough time of your career. I'm just starting to lead projects, and I realise I have serious imposter syndrome. Okay, imposter syndrome is ubiquitous for women, especially in Australia, which means we find we're in leadership positions and don't understand how we got there and don't think we can do it. When we have our introduction on the Women in Leadership program, it's almost universal amongst the women in the program, and they all look at each other and say, oh, I thought I was the only one. But it is actually across the board. So yes, it is a psychological barrier. Growing into your role as leader is a little bit about getting some of those leadership skills so you can be objective about yourself. But one of the biggest things is valuing the contribution that you can bring and valuing the fact that having an imposter syndrome has some positive effects. You tend to value others' opinions more. You don't assume that you are right. You don't assume that you know how to do something. And it actually makes you more inclusive. It makes you much harder on yourself, but it does make you more inclusive. So there are some advantages, but a mentor is incredibly valuable, and leadership training both are really useful to get over imposter syndrome. And all I can say is now that you've recognised it, when you see it, pick yourself up about it. And when you see it in others, pick them up about it too. Isabella said, any tips for getting through the preschool years? My biggest tip for getting through the preschool years is stop feeling guilty. I just wish someone told me that when I had my two beautiful young ones. You cannot always be at home. You cannot always be at work. There is no problem being at work. Sorry, there is no purpose to being at work and feeling guilty for not being at home, or being at home and not feeling guilty for when you go to work. One of my very senior male colleagues recently said to me, when we were putting an initiative forward to federal government about the critical need to fund childcare for Australian women so they can go to work for as much as they wish to and reach their career capacity. His response instantly was, we've got to be careful. We don't want all the women working all the time because all our children will be drug addicted and on the street. And I had to shake my head a couple of times to think about what he really said. But I then went and pulled out all the evidence and sent it to him, and pretty much said, actually, if you have daughters, having a working mother is much better. And if you have sons, it doesn't have a detrimental effect. So these old concepts of the fact that you think you have to be there every minute and potentially helicopter parent and do gymnastics and football and soccer and swimming, and you actually don't. And so one of the critical things I wish people actually told me back then was I just don't need to, I need to work out what's right for me and my family as a family unit at any one time. I need to not build all these stereotypes of what I need to be in one role or another. I need to feel less guilty and try and enjoy the journey a bit more. So I think there's nothing wrong with stalling a career for a while, but actually be a bit strategic. Take on some committee roles. They don't take a lot of work, but they will still advance your leadership skills, even though you're not necessarily really deep in task-oriented work. So don't let them go, and have honest discussions with your bosses and others around you to say, look, I actually really am committed to my career. I might need a bit of a lull here, but I'd like a strategic pathway. I have that discussion with every one of my people in my team. I have 12 on maternity leave at the moment. Great for them, but challenging for us. But we have that discussion about career planning right from the start, even sometimes before they have maternity leave. So think about that, and again, think about how you can make that work for you. Gillian has noted, and I know we're nearly at the end here, sometimes women have the confidence, capability, and capacity. However, there are subconscious biases. Absolutely. For those of you who have seen Annabelle Crabb's can't remember the name of the, there's a fantastic series she's done, Misrepresented. Some of our top female leaders, Julie Bishop and other politicians, talked about their experience of being in a room and coming up with a brilliant idea and contributing it. And everyone just murmurs and no one takes up the concept. And 3 people later, a male colleague has exactly the same thought and it's the best idea ever and it's adopted because it's coming from someone who they don't see and respect as having credibility as a leader. That unconscious bias is definitely there. And there is ways to build male awareness of the problem and call it out in a diplomatic, constructive, helpful way. One of the ways not to do that is to make men feel alienated and feel like they can't address the problem or they can't have a discussion in the space, whereas actually providing education, calling out unconscious bias, working in a constructive way. And in fact, you can do that through mentoring. If you're a mentee and you're going to advice to a male colleague, all the time you're working with them, you're educating them. actually teaching them about your journey and the juggles you've got with family and career or with unconscious bias indirectly actually educates them, because senior males think there is no problem anymore. They actually think women have got all the opportunity in the world and there's nothing that needs to be corrected. And clearly women at the early stage of their career, especially juggling family, feel most disadvantaged. So actually talking to our mentors can really make a difference there. And Gillian, I might take some of that answer offline with you later. Ellen Bodger-Harris has put the link in there for the free mentoring videos, so please do look at that if you wish. How to balance it all. Yeah. So don't do everything all at once. Stage it every, I'd say 6 months, but every year get off the bullet train. Go on a holiday or do whatever it is with your family, with your partner, and plan. Here we are. This is the life stage we're at. How are we going to look after our family unit? How are we going to make this work for ourselves? We plan everything else. We don't plan and value ourselves often. So you can't have it all at once. Most of us can have what we need if we work out what's most important to us as a family unit. It is a lot to juggle, but as I said, you don't have to do it all at once. I used to think you could have it all. I think before I started realising how big that boulder was to pull up the hill. And then I moved away to say, no, you can't have it all, but you can stage things and prioritise things as long as you stop and keep planning and value the role that you have and the contribution you can make. You're very welcome, Miriam. Thank you for saying thank you. And there's also a few resources in the chat. Definitely takes a village to bring all of this together. In fact, I was just about to get married and someone gave me a handbook about how to be an ideal 1950s wife, you know, the curlers and the slippers and the newspaper for my husband at the door. And I remember looking at it and saying, you know, what would make you want to do this? I took it home and gave it to my husband. He laughed and he said, we both need one of these. It's called a slave. Definitely knew I was marrying the right person. But the point is that many of our careers are actually built for a primary bread winner or income earner who works after hours, who's on call, who's running grants to all hours. And that's really hard with often a two-career family. So actually getting support and respecting yourself is really, really important to do that. Thank you, Sharon. I'm glad it was useful. And I probably will stop there, but I think the Advancing Women in Healthcare Leadership is national. So please do look at the website, and there are people all around the country involved, especially in a range of different areas. And good luck for your PhD submission. And I think really hope that some of this has been useful. And do think about looking at the Advancing Women in Healthcare Leadership page and linking up for the newsletter. We're just here to help inspire and engage and share and make you realise it's not just you. I'm glad it was empowering. Thank you. I love doing this, by the way. And so, yes, we can share the slides with you all and the video recording. So I hope that was useful. Right on time, we'll end there. And if any of you, there's not an ad because we're actually oversubscribed, but if any of you are interested, we do run that Women in Leadership program, which is pretty heavily subscribed. But if it's of interest, it might be worth looking at. So on that note, really hope that was useful, and value yourselves. That's my primary message. Thanks, everybody.